Hello, everyone. I'm Dwayne Bonifer in the Lindsey Wilson College Office of Public Relations, and this is The View from the Hill, the podcast of Lindsey Wilson College. Every week during the academic year, The View from the Hill features conversations with some of the people who help create the dynamic living, learning environment that serves the educational needs of every Lindsey Wilson student every day. In this 13th edition of the 2025 View from the Hill podcast, we're going to talk about the Great Gatsby, which celebrates its centenary on April 10th. And we'll do it with two of the best, Lindsey Wilson English professors Rachel Carr and Kendall Sewell. F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, was published on April 10th, 1925, and this spring has seen numerous literary celebrations of its centenary. For this edition of A View from the Hill, I sat down with two of Lindsey Wilson's experts on The Great Gatsby, English professors Rachel Carr and Kendall Sewell. We talked about the novel's importance, how it came to be published, and I also asked them to discuss some of their favorite excerpts of the novel, which will be featured in the second half of this episode. The Great Gatsby was not an immediate hit, yet today the novel is one of those titles that most people have read, sometimes more than once, depending on their major or their chosen profession. That's something Fitzgerald probably couldn't have imagined when he died in 1940 at the age of 44. After its first 15 years of publication, The Great Gatsby had sold a paltry 25,000 copies. Today, the novel has sold more than 30 million copies. It averages a sale of about 500,000 copies per year. One of Rachel's classes recently finished reading The Great Gatsby, so I asked her why we continue to read on the 100-year-old novel.
So this was actually the question I started American Lit 2 off today. We just finished reading The Great Gatsby, and this was our kind of opening discussion. Why should we still read The Great Gatsby? Why are they so invested in this? Does it still hit for them? Did the students still like it? And they all said yes. And so I'm stealing a student's answers here. It's Jesse LaGrange. He was actually on the podcast, I think, a week or two ago. He made this incredible point. We were thinking about, of course, the symbolism of the American dream, all the things we still relate to coming out of a pandemic, the upheavals of the 20s, our anxieties about the future and class change. But as we were thinking about the green light in the end, Jesse said, well, yeah, Gatsby's reaching for the green light, but I think it's that he's just really striving and reaching for something. It's more than the American dream. It's about having hope. And if we don't have hope, what do we have? It's about our goals and desires and just getting to believe that one day we'll get it, or else what's the point? So of course this novel still resonates with us. Of course it still has so much power. The love story, the longing, the human conflicts, but also our desire to believe we're going to make it one day.
Kendall, you've also taught The Great Gatsby. Why do we still need to read it? Why do we still read it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind is just it's something that F. Scott Fitzgerald said about books and writing in general, which is that like the writer should always like write for the youth of his generation, the critic of the next, and like the schoolmaster ever after. And so I think he's thinking about so many different audiences there, and it lands with so many different groups in that way. And I think particularly in that last direction, the schoolmaster. And like Rachel said, it's a book that is not just beautiful language, but replete with just so many of the literary elements that students like, the symbolism, the elements that are there on the page that are also not totally spelled out for them. They can sort of think about what does that green light mean? What does the sort of symbolism of Eckelberg's eyes, pretend for Gatsby and other characters there. So we can think about it in so many different ways. It becomes a teachable book, both for like the schoolmaster, but for, I think, just people in the culture for trying to understand what is happening, what has happened, where have we been, and where are we going.
You've also taught The Great Gatsby to high school students. How sort of, I guess I'll ask an English question, compare and contrast differences between how The Great Gatsby is received on the high school and the college levels.
Oh, that's a really funny question. Yeah. I think I've been really shocked by how so many high schoolers, they love this book. And I think some people, they read it as a how-to manual at first, and they think like, okay, I'm going to get rich. I'm going to become famous. I'm going to get the girl. But then they start to think about it, right? And they realize like, oh, this doesn't work out for Gatsby in the end, right? Spoiler alert, sorry for anybody. And then so they start to reflect on like, well, what do I want? And so I think, I taught it especially to juniors when they're right there at the cusp of they're thinking about senior year, they're thinking about their future, they're taking the ACT, they're like going on college visits. And so they're starting to think like, well, what do I want out of this life? And some of them start to think like, well, if that's the future, I don't know. So they start to question these things, or they start to think about like, well, what are the next steps for me? And I think Gatsby inspires a lot of that for them. For the college students, I think it hits in a different way where they have made some decisions about their life, right? And so now they're either reflecting about where they are and what they want out of like the sort of life after college. What does that adulthood look like for them?
Rachel, do you recall the first time you read The Great Gatsby? How did you respond to it? And since then, you've read it subsequent times in order to teach the novel. How has your opinions of it changed since?
The first time I read it had to be in high school, probably that junior year, study curriculum. And I remember thinking, this is such a beautiful novel. I was so interested in Nick's take on what was happening, his motivations for following Gatsby or being so into this story. But that was kind of it for me. It wasn't until rereading it in college with a group of friends that I think we understood more of the motivations of falling in love, of the pain, of sacrificing for what feels right or what you sort of have to do for your career, for your life, like just to be successful. And so I ended up finding actually an edition I had that was a present from a friend with a nice inscription on our friendship or sort of the relationships you build in college that end up becoming like lifelong. I saw the movie, cheating a little bit from the book, my senior year with a group of other English major friends, including Kendall, actually. And then I think my most emotional read was actually with my older sister. We're 13 years apart. We're also pretty different. She's into like medical sales. I'm over here in literature and professoring, but she loves it. It's one of her favorite books. I have a piece in my office now that's an artwork from her of the ending of the novel and thinking about motivations to improve yourself, the tragedy of this story. What does it mean to really love? Seeing through Gatsby's choices. But the discussions we had brought us so much closer. So now it's this book that I really associate with family. And then also just now getting to teach it and seeing the students fall in love, seeing what it brings for them, their reactions to the characters. It's so ambiguous and interpretive that it's a novel you can keep with you for your life because each time you read it, it means something different. Your understanding of the characters is so different. And so I think it's kind of one of those books that you have to return to regularly that has to kind of grow with you.
Kendall, what about you? When did you first encounter The Great Gatsby? And then how has your opinions of it or your feelings toward it changed over time?
So for me, like Rachel, I think the first time I would have read this was definitely in high school. And it was that junior year. And I remember it was with, it was one of those English teachers who's like a formative English teacher for me who sort of led the class along through her sheer just enthusiasm for the book. But I know I had a friend, my oldest friend from home, Terry. I hope he doesn't mind me flaming him for a second here. But we read the book together, right? And he immediately told me he didn't like it. Like he hated this book. And I think like the contrarian spirit in me said like, well, I love this thing, right? And so we would talk about the differences and I was engaging with the symbolism of it. And I thought, yeah, this is beautiful. And I don't know, as a high schooler, whether I did that purely as a contrarian or because I really got the book or something. But I know then I, left and went on to study English and encountered it again in English classes here at Lindsey and got to read it again. And much like Rachel, like you find new reasons to love it, new reasons to enjoy it. And it was about that time, like later, a few years later, I hear from Terry and he's in a lit appreciation class at his college. He reads The Great Gatsby and tells me, you know what? You were right. That's a great book. And again, he had a different set of life experiences to come at the book with. One of the things that stuck with him was just thinking about like, not just the tragic figure of Gatsby, but like all that Gatsby had done to try to become someone. There's that moment at the end of the book where you find out that he had made this list, this kind of like list of protocols that he went by day, getting up at 6 a.m., thinking about how to improve not just himself, but what inventions need to be made in the world. What sorts of things can he do to learn? Practicing his elocution, for example. And, that's straight out of Ben Franklin, like how to make yourself a better man, how to make yourself a better citizen. And I think those kinds of elements really, really landed with Terry. And that's just like one small example. That's 2-3 pages of the novel that became really formative for him and sort of revised his idea about what he thought. And so for me, that's what it is. If a person doesn't like the book, if a high schooler said, I don't like it, I'd say, give it 5-10 years, try it again.
Rachel, The Great Gatsby was published in 1925, 100 years ago this April. A lot was happening in the United States. A lot was happening in the world in the 1920s. It's almost impossible to read The Great Gatsby without some historical context.
Well, I think a lot was happening is almost an understatement to try to describe the anxieties of this time when Fitzgerald is writing. So, of course, it connects to us as we think about coming out of a pandemic, having anxieties about gender roles and life changes and class and our economic future. Of course, this novel still speaks to us. So we see through Tom and Daisy's relationship such tension around changing traditional marriage of, do you marry someone for class status because you're supposed to, or do you fall in love and get to marry for love? Women didn't have that option. Daisy certainly doesn't. And we see her ultimately end up back with Tom. She picks the money and the safety and the glass safety. Women have had the right to vote for 5 years at this point, 6 maybe. We're also in the worst point of race relations. We're in the rise of the Klan. You're feeling tension around new city structures, development, migration. What is America going to look like? Those anxieties play out with Tom, this Yale educated figure who's turning to eugenics and pseudoscience to try to soothe himself about his own future. You also, of course, see this follow from World War I. Characters are referencing it, and while they're not really getting into it, of course, they're so traumatized from what they've seen and the bigger fallouts from World War I around class. While we usually talk about changes to nobility and the class structure of Europe, I mean, America has a nobility too, and Tom and Daisy are it. Nick is kind of the in-between, and we see him fall in love with the potential Gatsby represents and throw his lot in with Gatsby for this new future, and then ultimately find it meaningless. It's like the class power preserves throughout.
Kendall, the late Kentucky author Hunter S. Thompson, said that he once typed the entire Great Gatsby because he wanted to experience what it was like to write great literature. Fitzgerald just didn't sit down on a typewriter, though, and pour out The Great Gatsby. It took a while for this novel to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that Hunter S. Thompson quote. But as Rachel is saying, there is so much that is influencing where this novel is going and what it sort of contains. But at the same time, this was a work in progress for a long time for Fitzgerald. I mean, he had conceived of drafts of this. One of the original titles for The Great Gatsby was Trimalchio in West Egg. So it's hard to imagine that being like the catchy kind of canonical title that we have now, right? There was another one like Golden-Headed Gatsby was another title he worked on. And so he was not just thinking about all these sorts of elements in the culture in American society, but quite literally going through multiple drafts of this novel, working with his editor to think about where this would go. And we think about it as it's always, up there on the list of what are the great American novels, Moby Dick, The Great Gatsby, right? These are always kind of, they make top 5, top 10 lists all the time. It barely sold enough copies to continue publication. It's hard to find a second edition of The Great Gatsby these days. And then years later, we hand it out to U.S. servicemen and they come back World War II and, it has sort of established itself in the culture there. They go to college and continue to think about this. And now you're hard pressed to find an American student who doesn't read this at some point in their high school career. And so I think there are these material conditions for it, but it also has these sorts of cultural touchstones that Rachel is talking about that keep sort of coming up. But the idea that, he sits down and just writes this like the birds sing, that's not exactly how it happened, right? This was a long work in progress for Fitzgerald, but he knew he had something good.
You're listening to the Lindsey Wilson College View from the Hill podcast, and I'm Dwayne Bonifer in the Lindsey Wilson Office of Public Relations. It's all about the centenary of The Great Gatsby during this podcast. Now let's get back to my conversation with Rachel and Kendall. All right, I'm not going to pass up the opportunity of sitting next to two outstanding English professors and experts on The Great Gatsby without asking them to select something from one of the greatest novels and comment on it. So, Rachel, I'll start with you. What's a passage, what's a part of The Great Gatsby that you think is especially strong or sticks out to you?
Thanks. Well, actually, I want to start by thinking about some foreshadowing in the novel and the most important to interpret it for me right now. So the first, as I pull my giant book over here, is this conversation early between Jordan Baker, the golfer who's maybe a cheat, and Nick, our narrator, who's fallen a little bit in love with her. So as he's reflecting the conversation, he thinks, it made no difference to me. Dishonesty dishonesty in a woman is a thing you never blame deeply. I was casually sorry, and then I forgot. So we're thinking about gender and changes and the way Nick's story is so centered about Gatsby that we maybe can't trust his take on other characters. It matters so much. But at this point, they're driving back. She is actually driven so close to a man on the side of the road that she has knocked the button off his coat or hit it. And so he turns to her and says, "You're a rotten driver," I protested. "Either you ought to be more careful or you oughtn't to drive at all." "I am careful." "No, you're not." "Well, other people are," she said lightly. "What's that got to do with it?" "They'll keep out of my way," she insisted. "It takes two to make an accident. Suppose you meet somebody just as careless as yourself." "I hope I never will," she answered. "I hate careless people. That's why I like you." So I love the sort of flirty dynamic in these lines, but also it's such good foreshadowing, of course, for the real car accident, but also that there are two groups of people that we should think about in this text, or sort of the takeaway from this text: the careless and the careful. This is the class divide for me that stands out so much. And it echoes right back in the end, where Nick has come back after everything has happened, after Gatsby's funeral. He's here to talk to Jordan. He feels like he can't move back home and just ghost her. He has to do the honest thing, have a face-to-face. He can't just send her the Dear John letter and vanish. So they're talking. She's a little bitter. She tells him she's engaged to someone else. And then finally at the end says, "Oh, and do you remember," she added, "a conversation we had once about driving a car?" And Nick says, "Well, why?" "Well, not exactly." And she says, "You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver?" "Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person. I thought it was your secret pride." "I'm 30, I said. "I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor." So we see again this little sparring dynamic, but it's our first push against Nick, who keeps telling us so often this narrative that he's the only honest person he's ever known. He has to report things as they are. Well, and maybe he really hasn't been. But also, when we think about why is this relevant, or why is this novel so relevant to us now? What does it mean? What's our takeaway? Well, it feels like our country is sort of divided in this way too, that half of us are always waiting for the shoe to drop. We're the careful. We're so carefully crafting things, like that beautiful, heartbreaking passage Kendall mentioned of Gatsby's daily list where he's working so hard. And then half of us are the shoe that's about to drop on the other half, who do just get to be reckless and hope things will be okay and fall into this bigger safety net, or just believe the country's going to go on as it is. And like Gatsby learns, if you're part of the careful class, no matter what you do, you're never going to make it into the careless group.
Kendall, is there a passage or two that particularly stick out to you?
Yeah, I think you absolutely have to think about just the beginning of chapter 2, which is, just after Nick has like reunited with Daisy, his cousin, and he's met Tom, Daisy's husband, and it's before he's met Gatsby, right? We spend a long time actually in the novel before we ever encounter Gatsby. And this passage, it's about what's called the Valley of Ashes, which is like, it's represented so well in the Baz Luhrmann film and so many of the others. But I really think the description is worth thinking about because it also sets up our thinking about some of these other characters that are involved in the novel too. And so it begins by saying, about halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad, runs beside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort of men who move dimly and already crumbling through powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak, and comes to rest, and immediately the ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud, which screens their obscure operations from your sight. This is apocalyptic, right? This is post-apocalyptic in some ways, the terrain there, the sort of description of this land. And he goes on to describe, here is where we see the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg sort of looming over this place. And it's right after this that Nick is introduced to Tom Buchanan's mistress. She's in this sort of in-between zone. And so you can read this in so many ways. I like it because it is it's indicative of how this novel, like we've been saying so many times, can be interpreted in so many directions. You can think of this as a place where, well, you have these sharp divisions between these class lines, right? The Buchanans have their sort of their safe space in the egg, and then you come to the sort of land in between where everything is permissible and everything is fine, because this is a sort of forgotten zone. But it also just speaks to the moment in which this novel is appearing too. This sort of industrial moment in early 1920s America where so much has shifted and so much is still changing. And then you think about the cast of characters we have here. We have Midwesterners who have moved back to the East, right? Where that is industrial. They've moved away from a Midwest that is really just recently settled to this place that is foul with the ash of industry, depending on where you are, right? If you drive a little further, you have sort of green lights and golden docks, right? And everything is fine.
So my favorite passage that's always stuck with me for the beauty of the language and what it represents is this moment of Gatsby's death, actually, where he's waiting in the pool for a message from his butler because he's still so convinced that Daisy will call, even when it's become so clear that she is staying with Tom. So he tells the butler to get him immediately, bring the phone out to the pool. And then Nick sort of starts to speculate on what Gatsby's death would have been like. And he says, I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghost, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. So, of course, the figure coming in is Wilson, the husband of Tom's mistress, who mistakenly believes that Gatsby has hit and killed Myrtle with his car. But this passage, to me, the sort of haunting world shift, how one lost love can change everything for you, that's such a human, crushing element. But also this living too long for a single dream that Gatsby has devoted his whole life to improvement, to money, to power, of course driven for Daisy, but also believing that he really can do the American dream. He can get it all. He can get the industry. He can get the girl. And the only avenues open to him are bootlegging, dealing, weird favors from the city commissioner. And at the end, when he loses Daisy, when he loses everything, the entire world becomes this hideous, curated rose. That line of like, what a grotesque thing a rose is. Well, he planted those roses for her, so she would think his mansion was beautiful and pretty and calm, and how grotesque this entire opulence class life he's living has actually been, and that this is what Nick imagines is this haunting moment before his death is so tragic. And also the language is just so stunningly gorgeous that it sticks with you. And
building on, I think, what Rachel was just talking about, the ending is what is so significant, I think, in so many ways about the novel. And you have, Nick who has tried to sort of bring people into the house and is so interested in trying to see where are the mourners for Gatsby? Where are the people who will be here to sort of mourn for this man? All these people who had filled his mansion, party after party. And so I think about the ending where he is thinking about the green light, about Gatsby's sort of hopefulness, that he comes back to this idea of Gatsby's optimism and hope. I think we have to think about these final passages and kind of like read those and think about what we can take away from them.
Rachel, why don't you start us off with that final passage, read a little bit of it, and then Kendall will come back to you and you can finish up as well for maybe the few people out there who, again, haven't read The Great Gatsby and don't know what is one of the great endings of one of the great novels in American literature.
And as I sat there, brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity behind the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night.
And then Kendall finish up with one of the great endings of all time.
Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
What a powerful ending. It's not it doesn't flow really that easily, especially when you read it out loud, but it's such a powerful ending.
It is. I like that it's more even more representative of, think of like Nick's, not just that first person perspective, but he's almost thinking mid-sentence there. He has a thought that he's about to sort of follow one fine morning. And that's almost a thought for his own future, I think, where Gatsby is thinking, is sort of drawing him to think in that way. But then he thinks again about this figure of Gatsby who is so consumed with thinking about, like, we can repeat the past, we can go back, and we're drawn to think about these sorts of things. And I think, again, he's drawn to that optimism that Gatsby highlights, but also the sort of forever struggle that we all face to try to repeat the mistakes that we've made or sort of change our course and find that sort of history keeps us in a direction that we didn't intend to go.
And you mentioned that the ending doesn't quite flow or feels a little odd, and you can have a literature professor on and not expect to talk about form, right? So when we look at the end, Fitzgerald actually stylistically breaks. We do get these odd dashes in the middle of sentences. We get the ellipses, the trailing off, and especially that "and one fine morning dash." And it's such a long one before that final "so we beat on, boats against the current." And this sort of blank longing to me is such a tonal shift, and it's a formal one too, that asks the reader, we move from Gatsby's story, where Nick has been so focused, to Fitzgerald's bigger takeaway of the novel. It is the place where we get to fill in this theme that Gatsby believed in the green light, and just like my student was saying this morning, we have to too. So the whole novel has told us about how it's inevitable that Gatsby's going to fail on making it across to West Egg, getting to join the class that he can never actually reach into. And then we get this formal break at the end of the novel saying, but that's no matter, dash, tomorrow we'll run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, and then the sudden cut off. So Fitzgerald is ending by asking us to think about this longing, this push, this hustle and grit that we're all going to keep doing, that we have to have hope for. And yet the whole story has been about how it's doomed that we're going to fail, but the journeys that we have to keep trying. So we're still supposed to be at the end of Nick's thoughts, but it does feel to me like we have shifted out of it almost. And especially this tragic line, "so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past," that we want to repeat the past, we want to try to fix it, but also we're never ever going to escape it.
That's English professor Rachel Carr. You also heard from fellow English professor Kendall Sewell. Big thanks to both of them for sharing their time and thoughts on The Great Gatsby. And that's a baker's dozen for 2025's View from the Hill. View from the Hill is produced by Shelby Burton, who is Lindsey Wilson's Assistant Director of Public Relations and Media Producer. And you can tell us what you like or don't like about this podcast by firing off an email to us at news@lindsey.edu. Be sure to put podcast in the subject line. Also be sure to encourage your friends, family members, and neighbors to subscribe to A View from the Hill. You can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcast, and we wouldn't mind it if you gave us a nice rating on either or maybe both of the platforms. You can also enjoy this podcast on the college's YouTube channel. To find this episode or previous episodes, just point your internet browser to youtube.com/LWC Public Relations, then click on the podcast tab. Until our next edition, I'm Dwayne Bonifer in the Lindsey Wilson Office of Public Relations. Thanks so much for listening. So long, everybody, and have a nice day.